I wanted to share something with you that I've observed clinically in the last few years as I continue to hone my skills of applying GNM and the 5 biological laws to help my patients really overcome their symptoms. Now, I have patients that will often come to me and they'll tell me that, okay, I'm a little bit confused because the last time I was here, we figured out that my neck pain has to do with my mother, making me feel like I'm making a mistake regarding my life choices. And it started to get better, but I don't understand why it flared up because I wasn't around my mother. I was at home one morning dealing with my kids, and then it started to hurt, and my mom wasn't even around. I wasn't thinking of her. I didn't talk to her. How come it flared up when my mom isn't even there if it's tied to my mom? And so this is a fairly common occurrence. This is something that many patients have brought up. And one of the things that I've started to recognize is that when you have the original conflict, so you have that DHS, you have that unexpected event take place in your life that leads to the biological program that triggers the symptoms in your body, depending on what subjective meaning you put on that conflict, you can have extensions related to that original conflict. And it's these extensions that really become the tracks or triggers that even if this original conflict is no longer there, but that extension of that conflict is around, it will be a reminder of the original conflict and therefore will trigger your symptoms to show up or to flare up. Just to be more specific with this, regarding that patient, she came in with this neck pain, saying that it was for a couple of years. She tried all sorts of therapies. It wasn't getting any better. And we figured out it had to do with her mother. With neck pain, it has to do with an intellectual self-evaluation. You're not smart enough. You're making a mistake. You're doing something wrong, and you're doubting yourself. And we recognized in this particular case, it had to do with her mother. And she was shocked at how her mother responded to her when she decided to go back to school. Her mother started saying, you're doing it all wrong. Why didn't you finish school before you got married and had your kids? And so there was a bit of a conflict there where, in fact, this patient had to live with her mother while she was going to school because the school was closer to where her mother lived. The mother helped with taking care of the family and the kids and this sort of thing. But what was interesting was that she started to get better in one visit as she made the connection that this has to do with her mother because she was no longer living with her mother by the time that she came to see me. One morning while she was getting her kids ready for school, her neck pain flared up. And she didn't understand why because her mother wasn't around and everything was okay now regarding her mother. Her symptoms actually got better for a few weeks and then it just flared up seemingly out of nowhere. As we started to discuss this, the original conflict had to do with her mother making her feel not smart about her decision. But part of the extension or the meaning that she put on her mother's comment or criticism was that because I'm going back to school and my mother thinks I'm making a mistake, that means I'm making a mistake with my kids. I'm messing up my role as a mother with my kids. That means that I'm messing up my relationship with my husband because I'm not going to be there for him. So do you see how she started to create these extensions or meanings behind her mother's comment and criticism, behind the original conflict? What we figured out was whenever her children acted up, they weren't listening to her, they were freaking out in the morning, getting ready to school, that became a track for her or a trigger that reminded her, see, your mother was right. You made a mistake because look at your kids now. You didn't do a good job as a mother. And so this is one of the things that's important for you as a practitioner. If you're working with clients like this, a lot of times they'll say, well, my issue has to do with work, but how come it flared up and I'm somewhere that's not even at work? Well, it depends on what meaning they put on that original conflict. If that conflict from work has to do with a lack of support because your boss doesn't support you, perhaps anywhere else in your life that you feel the same way, that there's somebody else that reminds you of your boss or treats you the way your boss treats you in any social setting, or you feel unsupported the way your boss made you feel unsupported, your symptoms could also flare up. Okay, so just a quick note to recognize this in those of you dealing with your own symptoms, right? Recognize that there's the original conflict and then there's these extensions or the meaning that you put on that original conflict, that even when that conflict or that person that's tied to that original conflict is not around, the tracks and triggers that you've developed, the meaning could also trigger your symptoms to flare up. So just be conscious of that, make the connection of why it's happening, and then the symptoms will subside once again. And that's really the case with that patient. Once she understood that okay, I'm going to look at it differently. I'm going to change that perspective that just because my kids act up have nothing to do with me being a bad mother because of what my mom said. Okay, so you change the meaning around it, you break that association, and hopefully that's going to help alleviate those symptoms and minimize you getting flare-ups and potentially close the biological program.